Welcome, online viewers. This is lecture number 12, the last lecture in our series, the 50 Years That Changed Painting. I'd like to thank Andrew Dyer and Donna Marie Kelly for having sponsored this series and its transfer online, and the Drill Hall Gallery at the Australian National University for having invited me to give this series of lectures. 50 years may not seem such a long time on the scale of most people's lived experience. If you think back to the popular culture of 50 years ago, disco music was a big thing. Pink Floyd's The Dark Side of the Moon, then available on vinyl or on cassette tapes, seemed to be everywhere. The first Godfather movies came out. MASH was on the television screens. Punk rock came on the scene exactly 50 years ago. None of this seems so very distant or so alien to where we are today. However, on the other hand, many major cities have changed beyond recognition in 50 years. The lifestyles and standards of living many take for granted these days were unthinkable back then. Neoliberal economics, espoused in the US and UK, spread abroad by the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, irrevocably changed the world and established an impassable gulf between then and now. Likewise, the revolution in digital technology has created its own special kind of havoc and has penetrated deeply into our political and cultural fabric. Consider, however, that the 50-year period we've been investigating in this lecture series would have been just as momentous in the thoroughgoing way it changed people's lives. History is written from the vantage point of its victors and its beneficiaries, as we've all been taught. The victors and beneficiaries in this case were, of course, modernists. Yet let's be clear that their putative victory existed largely through the benefit of hindsight. Whistler's prospects were ruined by scandal. Van Gogh couldn't sell his paintings. Malevich was warned that suprematist paintings were not permissible, according to the Soviet authorities. Mondrian died alone of pneumonia, exacerbated by malnutrition, in New York in 1944. There are dozens of such tales, one might add. So if this was the fate of the victors, what befell the vanquished? The old guard didn't die out suddenly. It was more or less pensioned off, notwithstanding the fact that its former cultural eminence would now be almost completely ignored and forgotten. One of the repercussions of the First World War was to sweep away much of the detritus of the old world. The gentleman on the screen is Jerome Arthur Eddy, who was a prime witness of the 50 years that changed painting. Eddy was a very rich American who had his portrait painted by Whistler, and he published a book about the conversations he had had with Whistler during those posing sessions. He also commissioned this portrait bust by Rodin. Eddy became a fearless and particularly insightful partisan of modern art, keen to get to know the artists he admired in person and to relay their conversations through the books he published. Eddie bought this painting directly from Kandinsky's studio in 1913, where there were two works that particularly struck him. Improvisation number 30, which you see here, subtitled Cannons, and improvisation number 31, subtitled Sea Battle. How was it that Kandinsky had picked up the intimations of war and impending catastrophe in 1913, a year before it actually eventuated and took the majority of people by surprise? Kandinsky told Eddie that the presence of cannons in this picture could probably be explained by the constant talk of war that had been going on through the year. Constant talk of war by whom? It wasn't only Kandinsky who put his forebodings into his art during 1913, or even earlier, as we shall see. Eddie's book, Cubists and Post-Impressionists, Cubists and Post-Impressionism, came out in 1914 and was the first book published in the United States to present an overview of modern art, and probably the first English-language book to deal with Kandinsky as a serious artist. Since Eddie's tastes, his remarkable openness to cubism and to abstraction develops from an early admiration for Whistler, linking, in effect, the alpha and omega of our saga of the 50 years that changed painting. He's certainly someone we should want to honor. However, the question of Kandinsky's prescience about an imminent war, how might we explain that? This is a map of the world showing how things were in 1914. The great European powers were glutted with wealth obtained from their colonial empires, greatly boosted by industrialization, which was most intensive and most advanced in Britain and Germany, and from the railway networks that had greatly increased the volume and speed of trade and communication. A considerable amount of the surplus wealth went into building warships and stockpiling armaments, and almost every innovation in 19th century science and technology that brought practical benefits, employment, and profit acquired a diabolical double: good for killing, maiming, and destroying. There was an arms race. There was militarization. There was a professional class of, if not exactly warmongers, then of generals more than ready to step up and test their skills. Then, of course, there was the press, the free press, with little or no accountability, all too eager to ferment hatred, fear, and panic, and to provide the spark that would ignite a major conflagration. It was not so difficult to anticipate how such a scenario might play out after all. Still, the causes of war unraveled in a way that would be hard to predict, utterly disastrous in the sequence and scale of their repercussions. The Austro-Hungarian Empire didn't have overseas colonies like the other major powers, but it was an amalgam, shaky in some of its parts, straddling 14 European language groups. At the height of its prosperity, with the brilliant capital cities of Vienna, Prague, Budapest, home to the greatest writers, composers, thinkers, architects, and designers of the era, Austria-Hungary was about to drag other major European powers into a most savage epic of bloodletting and devastation on a scale never known in the whole of human history. On the 28th of June 1914, the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who we see on the screen, had travelled to Sarajevo to inspect the empire's unsettled and troublesome southern dominions. Heedless of warning about his safety, he was assassinated by a Bosnian gunman who had links to a Serbian nationalist organization. Serbia lay outside the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and there was a simmering antagonism which had been caused by the annexation of Bosnia in 1908. The Archduke was the heir apparent to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his aggrieved uncle, the Habsburg Emperor, issued a set of demands to the Serbian authorities to take reprisals against the nationalist organization blamed for the Archduke's assassination. While the Serbian authorities were solemnly deliberating about this ultimatum, the local newspapers were having a field day, completely unconstrained in expressing their indignation and disrespect, and when reports of this got back to Vienna, the effect was maddening. It was maddening also in reinforcing the Serbians' stubborn reluctance to comply with the terms of the ultimatum, which could mean only one thing: war. A war between Austria-Hungary and the Serbs might have seemed pretty much a storm in a teacup, which might be concluded in a short time with minimal loss of life. But this was not to be. When Austria declared war on Serbia, the Tsar of Russia, who you see on the lower left, stepped in, committing Russian support to Serbia. Then the Germans declared their alliance to Austria-Hungary and their aggressive intentions towards Russia and France. And so a domino effect drew not only Europe, but the European colonies into a world war, which would leave 9 million soldiers dead on the battlefields, 30 million military casualties, and 8 million civilian deaths. Bizarrely, three of the heads of state of the major antagonists, the Tsar of Russia, lower left, the Kaiser of Germany, upper right, and the King of England, lower right, were cousins, descendants of Queen Victoria. The Austro-Hungarian Emperor, upper left, was the prime mover of the war, no doubt about that. But the most determined, committed, and ferocious aggressor was the German Kaiser, Wilhelm II. He and his military advisors had been preparing assiduously for the next major conflict, whatever and whenever that might be. The German plan of battle, called the Schlieffen Plan, which was used for invading France in 1914, had actually been drafted in 1905, 9 years previously. The Germans' paranoid perspective on the world, their fear of encirclement by their enemies, their desire for revenge and retribution, and their ambition for supremacy is probably quite accurately conveyed by this 1914 propaganda cartoon, where Germany's boot is thrust into a mass of cowering French soldiers, the position of the boot coinciding with Alsace-Lorraine, although the big, scary threat comes from the east, from Russia. Before the prospect of war had even arisen, the German Colonel von Moltke had declared, "We are ready, and the sooner it comes, the better for us." There was a belief that if Germany didn't act promptly, it could be defeated in a future war with Russia and France. And in fact, Germany and Austria-Hungary were already armed to the teeth. New weaponry had become available. The machine gun was patented in 1883. Powered flight had been weaponized. Poison gas was introduced in 1915. Armored tanks became the great game changer at the end of 1916. Germany and Austria-Hungary also had the upper hand in long-range artillery. They'd built super heavy cannons, the so-called Big Berthas, that could hurl a 2,000-pound shell up to 9 kilometers. They'd also developed guns that outranged the guns of their adversaries, which enabled them to keep out of the line of fire and attack their enemies at arm's length. Their superiority in firepower came as a very nasty surprise to the Belgians and the French during the first weeks of the war. This appalling realization of German technical superiority came at a great human cost. On the 22nd of August, 3 weeks after the declaration of war, 27,000 French soldiers died in battle on a single day. This is an image taken by a photographer for the Sydney Morning Herald, showing how, from the other side of the world, Australians were being irrevocably drawn into the European conflict. Another photograph by a Sydney Morning Herald photographer, heartbreaking, really, showing the naive good faith on these young men's faces as they're being led into an unimaginable horror. The combatants on both sides opted for trench warfare, which created a territorial deadlock. The challenge was to break this deadlock and resume mobile warfare, but there was no obvious solution to the deadlock, and heavy bombardment over weeks and months had turned battlefields into lunar landscapes pitted with craters, turned to mud, and infested with rats who fed on the corpses rotting away in the no man's land between enemy lines. Robert Graves, in his famous memoir, Goodbye to All That, says that the average life expectancy of a subaltern on the Western Front was 3 months, by which time he would either be wounded or killed. In 1917, the British painter Paul Nash became an official war artist, producing a series of bleak pictures of desolated, devastated landscapes on the Western Front. The ironic title of this picture, We Are Making a New World, may have been detachable. It may have occurred to Nash as an afterthought. In all likelihood, it did. Nonetheless, there had been, and there still were, some fanatics for whom We Are Making a New World remained a slogan without any trace of irony, nor with any jot of compassion or remorse for the suffering and irreparable damage this war had brought about. There was an avant-garde stance long ago established, which we've seen developing during previous lectures, which came to the fore at this particular moment in history. It was based on a fantasy of sweeping away an oppressive, devitalized, decadent civilization and replacing it with a modernist utopia. That is to say, making a new world. The prospect of a global conflict was equated with, of all things, hygiene. It would effectively cleanse, purge, slenderize, and restore youth and virility to the antiquated, unhealthy, emasculated body of European culture. The Italian futurists had been the first to aestheticize violence and to glory noisily in the prospect of war. In the founding manifesto of Italian futurism, published in 1909, Filippo Tommaso Marinetti wrote, "Except in struggle, there is no more beauty, except in strife. No work without an aggressive character can be a masterpiece. Poetry must be conceived as a violent attack on unknown forces, to reduce and prostrate them before man." Harnessing publicity to increase the impact of the controversy and outrage they intended to provoke, the futurists began waging a war in the name of art. in the name of art, which was synonymous with an aggressively antisocial individualism. Futurists sought to engage and incite audiences to riot. Their buffoonery and bravado were developed to an extraordinary degree of virtuosity. They would stage events, happenings, that would stir up audiences to the point of explosion, brazenly flouting any semblance of politeness, moderation, convention, and seriousness, waging war on meaning itself, on regimes of meaning, which until then were considered fundamental to posterity and the visual arts. It was this latter aspect of futurism, the outrageous attitudinizing, the provocation, the contempt for social norms, that proved to be its most enduring legacy. Marinetti's stratagems were enthusiastically taken up by avant-gardists in Moscow and St. Petersburg. The famous or infamous Dada cabarets in Zurich during the war years were based on futurist precedents. In 1914, Marinetti published this broadside showing the wedge of futurism penetrating the flank of passéism, passatismo pertaining to Germany and Austria, to the enemy's mentality. The broadside opens by requoting the first Futurist Manifesto, to wit, that, quote, glorification of war is for us the only hygiene of the world. Interesting to note in passing the word synthesis in the heading, futurist synthesis of the war. By now this word had become ubiquitous in artistic circles. It figured in the title of the painting by Severini we saw earlier. Synthesis, such an important term in the evolution of modern painting. The word became current in the world of art, first of all among the artists of Gauguin's circle, among the early admirers of Cézanne, and among the Narby group. And in Braque's words, art begins only with synthesis. This was also a key term in Matisse's writing on art, but now the word crops up everywhere. Why should this be so? Synthesis, when it applies to a painting, acknowledges that a picture is first and foremost an intellectual construct. The unity, the resolution, the coherence of a visual statement cannot be guaranteed by any kind of referentiality, not by subject matter, not by resemblance. But it cannot be guaranteed by the lack or absence of these either. The result of synthesis is a whole greater than the sum of its parts. Distinctively modern painting, as we've seen, is made up of disconnected, fragmentary, heterogeneous elements. which require from the artist a high degree of synthetic intelligence, and this comes to be equated with creativity itself, the intention to put Humpty together again, so to speak. Walter Benjamin, in his classic study of Baudelaire, observed that Baudelaire's predilection was for brief, condensed, intensively wrought poems, nothing redundant about them, a perfect mesh of sound and sense, their perfection of form, demonstrating the poet's intellectual powers, his power of synthesis. Baudelaire wanted to make his poems crisis-proof, Benjamin alleges. Crisis-proof. That is to say, resilient to the instability and hazardousness of modern times, protected against reversals of fashion, defended against the havoc of revolution and war, which were the scourges of modernity. So, is it possible for there to be a synthesis of the idea of war being based on irreconcilable opposition and antagonism, synthesis seeking a stable pattern, a truce? On a symbolic level, yes, it's certainly possible. We looked at these works by Mikhail Larionov and Natalia Goncharova in the previous lecture. Produced in 1913, maybe earlier, they seem to anticipate the reign of violence, chaos, and nihilism that was to come. When war was declared, Larionov was called up for military service in Russia, and he and Goncharova left France and returned to Moscow. Very soon after being dispatched to the Eastern Front, Larionov was traumatically wounded and never recovered his powers of concentration, with the result that the great achievement and even greater promise of his Rayonist paintings was cut tragically short. As for Goncharova, left alone in Moscow, she produced a series of 14 lithographs, bound into an album, which must be one of the earliest explicit responses by an artist to the outbreak of war. As with Marinetti, she thought that the war would be a good thing, God-given, and watched over by good angels. The good angels were not looking out for her partner Larionov, that's for sure, and one can only wonder whether she had second thoughts about these shameful delusions, that this was a war that would end all war, that was going to purge and redeem a misguided, irreligious, materialistic populace. That was the advent of the apocalypse preceding the Last Judgment. Any similarity between Kandinsky's and Goncharova's ideas would be extremely difficult to prove, since his idiom is at great pains to shun any kind of topicality and to divest itself of referentiality in order to constitute a sort of visual music. Nonetheless, according to Kandinsky himself, this exceptionally complex painting, which had involved him in a great deal of labor, reflection, and struggle was based on the idea of the deluge, the catastrophic event described in the Bible, unleashed by God to purge an errant humanity of its evil ways. Kandinsky's aesthetic ideas of the time were strongly marked by apocalypticism, of course. But this apocalypticism wasn't so much historical and moralistic as it was archetypal and cosmic. And I quote Kandinsky, "Painting is like a thundering collision of different worlds." A thundering collision of different worlds that are destined in and through conflict to create that new world called the work. Technically, every work of art comes into being in the same way as the cosmos, by means of catastrophes. When war was declared, Kandinsky was identified as an enemy alien in Germany, and he had to return to Russia, where he remained until 1923. His relationship with Gabriela Munter didn't survive their physical separation, and he never again saw Franz Marc, his closest friend and number one collaborator in the Blauer Reiter publications, exhibitions, and events. Marc died in France in 1916, aged 36, on the battlefield of Verdun. Franz Marc may have seemed, to all intents and purposes, a reasonable, gentle, peaceable human being, not at all a warmonger, not a nihilist like Marinetti. Yet he embraced the advent of war with an extraordinary fervour, a mystical fervour, and also with the fervour of a German nationalist. War was a form of hygiene that would cleanse, purge, purify, and sanctify humanity and redeem people from their errant ways. In parallel to other works we've looked at, in 1913, Marc's painting, Fate of Animals, stages a clash of cross rhythms which tears through the pictorial field and seems to annihilate everything in its path. And this was probably the last painting he completed before his conscription, ostensibly a landscape, a mountain valley and a lake in the Tyrol, but the image is shattered and smashed. The apocalypse is nigh. Franz Marc's war sketchbooks are filled with drawings of animals, and this is one of the only drawings that may represent crossfire and bombardment, yet it is stylized, flower-like, even pretty when compared to the stridency and violence of his pre-war paintings. Félix Vallotton, formerly a Nabi painter, was a Swiss national, yet he volunteered as a war artist on the French side, and here at Verdun, where Franz Marc was killed a year previously, the trajectories of the death-bearing missiles have exactly the shapes of the vectors in Rayonist paintings and in Franz Marc's splintered landscapes. Vallotton's woodblock print shows dead soldiers caught in a tangle of barbed wire in the no man's land between enemy lines, ensnared by their implacable fate, as they are ensnared by the artist's line. It may seem massively insensitive and inappropriate to consider Vallotton's print and Georg Gross's drawing as part of an ongoing exploration of the potentials, formal, emotionally expressive, evocative, of non-objective art, to say of abstraction. But that is certainly part of their interest for any art historian today. Vallotton's choice of a title deliberately tips the emphasis this way. It's called fil de fer, which means wires, but fils, spelt the same way, is a son or sons, so the title is ambiguous, wires or sons of iron. Georg Gross's thicket of jangling lines plays on a similar ambivalence, yet even more boldly and brilliantly. The longer you look, the more you seem to see in it, but keep looking, and it unravels into a fractured, frazzled shambles, composing and decomposing, hysterical breakdown, and ingenious synthesis. This really is a drawing for the ages. Putting Humpty together again. That's what Fernand Léger appears to want to be doing in 1916. The modernism he envisages in his painting relates to technology, to mechanization, and to the acceleration of the rhythms of life, modernity as speed. Léger spent 3 years on the front lines. He fought at Verdun in 1916, maybe facing Franz Marc in the opposing trenches. Notwithstanding the horrors of being under fire and under bombardment, and seeing so many of his comrades killed and maimed, Léger's experience as a combatant was, in his own estimation, basically positive. Here's what he had to say in a statement published in 1924. I find the state of war much more normal and desirable than the state of peace. The state of war is none other than life with an accelerated rhythm. There, men and things are seen in all their intensity, with their hypertrophied value, seen in all its facets, tensed to breaking point. A very remarkable testimony coming from an artist, but Léger considered his life permanently enhanced by discovering community, solidarity, and egalitarianism as a soldier. War had disabused him of all snobbishness, sentimentality, and superstition. It had affirmed him as a thoroughgoing realist, in his attitudes towards life and death, in his attitudes towards class and culture, and in his attitudes towards painting as well. In 1917, Léger was hospitalized after a mustard gas attack on his squadron. During his convalescence, he was able to resume painting. This motif of card players inevitably invites comparison with Cézanne's famous treatment of the card player motif, although the game that Léger depicts is not being played by rustic workers, but by men of war. It is an allegory of the war. First and foremost, a war of technology, where the players are grotesque machines, hideous, inhuman, gambling with other people's lives, other people's livelihood, and other people's territories as their stakes. Georges Braque was promoted to lieutenant in the French army, but he lasted less than 6 months in the front line. In May 1915, he suffered a head wound and was left for dead in the no man's land on the battlefield of Carency. He was rescued at nightfall, barely alive, by stretcher bearers and was rushed into surgery, subjected to trepanation, that is to say, holes drilled into his skull to remove pressure on the brain. His injury left him temporarily blind, and it took a whole year in and out of hospitals for him to recover. Between 1908 and 1914, as you're by now perfectly aware, Picasso and Braque had been inseparable colleagues, and they shared the credit as co-creators of Cubism and co-innovators of such momentous innovations as collage and much, much beside. The declaration of war caught Picasso and Braque unawares. They were on holiday in the vicinity of Avignon in the south of France, and André Dada was there as well. The day after the Germans declared war, on the 2nd of August 1914, it was Picasso, a citizen of neutral Spain, who accompanied Braque and Dada to the train station in Avignon to see them off to war. Picasso's description of their parting is chilling. On the 2nd of August 1914, I took Braque and Dada to the station in Avignon. I never saw them again. He was speaking figuratively, of course. See each other they did in the years that followed, but they were no longer the people they had been. There was their war experiences had changed them irrevocably. Nothing would ever be the same again. As may happen with artists, maybe not as infrequently as we suppose, Picasso's way of coping with the loss of separation from his closest friends was not only to paint for them, but to paint as them, to paint in their stead, in their manner. In absentia, He painted as himself, and he painted as Braque might have done as well. Pondering their respective contributions to Cubist painting, distinguishing their individual characteristics, art historians generally characterize Picasso as a sort of deconstructionist and as a sculptural painter, as William Rubin put it, whereas Braque is a quintessentially painterly painter, as Edward Fry put it, who brought a, quote, mastery of surface plenitude, a mastery of surface unity, and a non-illusionist plasticity into the Cubist amalgam. This still life, begun in Avignon and completed in Paris, has, I would guess, the most painstakingly and elaborately developed surface qualities in the whole of Picasso's oeuvre, displaying the whole bag of tricks he and Braque had developed in tandem, with the in-jokes and quirky little inventions they delighted in, not to mention the patriotic knick-knack on the table, Vive la France. This painting is made up of the most heterogeneous swatches of things. No matter how odd, eclectic, and risky any of them might appear, or rather, the odder, more eclectic, and riskier, the better, because, as Braque put it, art begins only with the synthesis. Here, too, the subtle play of whites and off-whites, the surface plenitude and non-illusionist plasticity, the lucidity, sobriety, and serenity of this most beautiful Cubist still life are quite uncharacteristic of Picasso. It would seem that the stricken atmosphere of wartime and the presence in absence of Braque in Picasso's thoughts may explain this moment of grace. Henri Matisse was 44 years old when the war broke out. He was the breadwinner of a nuclear family of 5. He also had heart problems. He tried 3 times to enlist, but was knocked back each time. He attempted to use his long-standing friendship with Marcel Samba, who was a politician, a socialist deputy, to intervene on his behalf in order to join up. Realizing that Matisse's intentions could never succeed, Samba consoled him by saying that the best way you can serve your country is to continue doing what you do, to paint well. As was the case with virtually everybody in France, many of Matisse's close friends, family, and just ordinary acquaintances had enlisted, had been killed or wounded. Nobody was untouched by the maelstrom on the Western Front, a mere 40 kilometers from Paris at its nearest point. In 1915, the Matisses were sending 100 kilos of bread and biscuits to the front every week. displaced people, wounded servicemen, and relatives of wounded servicemen they took into their home. And Matisse clearly took Marcel Samba's words to heart. The best you can do for your country is to continue to paint well. Paint the best paintings within your capacity to achieve. These paintings on the screen do so many contradictory things at once. They're completely convincing representations of an interior, of a place, a time, the light, the space, a state of mind. But the resemblance, which seems so comprehensive and plausible, doesn't pertain to the parts. It's in the character of the whole. Each painting is an equivalence, a visual metaphor, a resembling unlikeness. Each painting is a visual field. These are field paintings, paintings seen whole, where the whole conditions all of its parts, where nothing is extraneous, where a sense of richness and fullness of experience is being communicated by the most pared down means. There are hints, of course, of the struggle Matisse went through to pare his means down to such a minimum, to evoke the most by means of the least. They're magnificent figurative paintings, yet paradoxically, they're among the toughest, flintiest abstract paintings you're ever likely to see. Matisse sees his paintings with the rigor and ruthlessness of an abstract painter. The image is an abstract construct. It has to resolve into the surface and shape of its support, the structure of the paint on the surface and the structure of the image overall must fuse into a single perception. The nightmare of history isn't overt in any of Matisse's works from the war period. However much we might want to read into them a sense of tragedy, danger, and anxiety held at bay, no doubt the pressure of reality would have forced their sobriety and gravitas to a considerable extent, and exacerbated Matisse's instinct to make his art crisis-proof. One of Matisse's greatest paintings, Bathers by a River, now in the Art Institute of Chicago, was begun as a commission for the great Russian collector Sergei Shukin for Shukin's house in Moscow. Matisse abandoned work on the painting in 1910, took it up again in 1913, then revised it completely in 1916 to 17. Nobody seems to agree with me on this point, but I see it as Matisse's belated and deeply pondered response to Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. During the 1930s, this painting was constantly on view in the lobby of the Valentine Gallery in New York. There it would have made an indelible impression on several up-and-coming artists of the New York school, Motherwell, Newman, Rothko, foremost among them. In August 1914, Mondrian was taken by surprise at the declaration of war. He'd spent the summer in the Netherlands and found himself unable to return to Paris. He remained in Holland till 1919. Mondrian had discovered modern art quite belatedly. He had established an artistic career as a very conservative, very traditional Dutch landscape painter. He was 40 years old when he came across Cubist painting and Cézanne. The Mondrian we know and revere, Mondrian as a ranking modernist painter, only really hits his stride during the war years when he was living in Holland. The drawing on the left may correspond directly to the painting on the right. I like to think that it does. Mondrian's prior landscapes tend to have vacant foregrounds. Interest starts in the middle distance. And in this wonderful drawing, the trees are still set back, but there's a great feeling of space and light that comes naturally to Mondrian. It's obviously there in his sensibility. As he develops an increasingly abstract idiom, you may think that this feeling for space and light gets suppressed, but that couldn't be further from the truth. It is sublimated, you might say, and lends a particular intensity to even his flintiest abstract compositions. As with Matisse, Mondrian's abstracted tree paintings conflate figure and ground. The image is made one with the surface, the substance, and the shape of the painting. The painting is a field that conditions everything within its purview. By 1914, any relationship between Mondrian's painting and a pre-existing motif or pretext out there in the world is now so tenuous that it's become more or less irrelevant. The pretext, such as it is here, is a pier jutting into the ocean, apparently observed from the 4th floor of a hotel in the seaside resort of Scheveningen, according to Mondrian himself, so it is said. But the dichotomy between pier and ocean has been almost entirely eliminated, and what remains is sheer flux. Flux that is contained, globalized, and composed. In 1915, Theo van Doesburg, a painter, writer, graphic artist, and architect, came across Mondrian's work, and their ensuing friendship bore extraordinary results. Mondrian, van Doesburg, Gerrit Rietveld, Bart van der Lek, and others collectively developed a genre of abstraction they called neoplasticism, which spanned the realms of painting, sculpture, architecture, and design. From October 1917 onwards, their collaboration took the form of a journal called De Stijl, which had its editorial headquarters in Leiden. This is one of the first of Mondrian's paintings to be based on a regular grid. And this is a series of demonstrations by van Doesburg, generating an abstract configuration through a series of steps that remove it from any referent. So attractive and influential were these ideas to architects that Mies van der Rohe, then at the Bauhaus, appropriated the schema of a drawing by van Doesburg for his plan of the Jericho House in 1930. And the Australian architect Harry Seidler found this kind of exploded cubist way of composing in planes in 3 dimensions, as exemplified by van Doesburg, a lifelong inspiration. In Zurich, during the spring of 1916, there occurred a remarkable confluence of artists, writers, and eccentric bohemians displaced by the war. Hugo Ball, whom you see on the screen as the Tin Man, Emmy Hennings and Richard Hülsenbeck were from Germany. Tristan Tzara and Marcel Janco were from Romania, and Hans Arp was from Strasbourg. Later that year, they were joined by Walter Cerner and Hans Richter, both from Germany. The interests the group had in common were their anti-authoritarian and anti-war politics, their interest in avant-garde poetry and painting, and their taste for bourgeois baiting. The Cabaret Voltaire became their performance space. The first Dada exhibition was held in Zurich in March 1917, and the first Dada review came out that July. One of the things that Dada's hagiographers seem consistently to want to overlook or to wish away is that the overwhelming majority of works in the first Dada exhibition and the first Dada review were abstract paintings. Abstract art was for us tantamount to absolute honor, Richard Hülsenbeck recollected, corroborated by Hans Richter, who added, in 1916, it was not yet clear in what direction Dadaist visual art would move, but by 1917, it was evident that the dialectical process would necessarily lead to so-called abstract art. Indeed, Kandinsky's painting is featured in the first Dada review, and Kandinsky, for several of the Dadaists, notably for Hans Arp, for Hans Richter, and for Hugo Ball, Kandinsky was the man. Hugo Ball gave a lecture on Kandinsky at the Dada Gallery in Zurich on the 7th of April 1917, in which he said, Kandinsky is liberation, consolation, redemption, and reassurance. One should undertake pilgrimages to his paintings. They are a way out of the turmoil, the defeats, and despair of our time. These drawings by Hans Richter, destined to illustrate the periodical Zeit Echo, are clearly inspired by Kandinsky's abstractions, but their intended reference jolts us out of any complacency. The world of the ox and the swine had its origin in the sight of pigs eating human corpses, with the ox's head symbolizing human stupidity. Between the pig's night and the ox's day, there is nothing left for man, Richter explained. Theo van Doesburg, far from being limited by his commitment to neoplasticism, to constructivism, and geometrical abstraction, also had a foot in the Dadaist camp and had a key role in the spread of Dada in Germany and Holland after the war ended. This is a poster by Van Doesburg for a Dada event in 1923. We need to wrap up and, if possible, lay to rest the thorny question raised earlier. Was modernism symptomatic of the great crack-up of the traditional humanistic culture of Europe? To what extent was it a prefiguration or a parallel to the catastrophe of the war? Van Doesburg denounced the abuse of ideas such as these when they were transposed from aesthetics, where they were valid and relatively innocuous, to politics and ideology, where they could license and condone the slaughter, the dispossession, and ruin of millions. I think Van Doesburg really deserves the last word here, so I'll quote from Hannah Hedrick's monographic study of Van Doesburg, which gives his answer to our question. Van Doesburg advocated the acceptance of strife as a source of creativity, but he repeatedly refused to accept war as a legitimate manifestation of the urge for conflict. When Zelling, a Dutch writer, praised Octave Mirbeau's war letters, claiming that the shock of the war was necessary to destroy an utter refinement and to guard against rigidity in order to enable a more complete expression of a people's vitality, Van Doesburg bitterly attacked such an attitude. All those cries, the despair, the insane shouts of horror, all those abandoned women, children, mothers, fathers, all those hearts, kidneys, intestines, muscles, brains, bones, one stew, too high a price to pay. Thank you for your interest. I hope you've enjoyed this series and will continue to enjoy it online.